Hello and welcome to the first edition of This Week in Mishna Yomi. I look forward to sharing with you on a weekly basis a more in-depth study of an idea that emerges from one of the Mishnayos that we would learn from This Week in Mishna Yomi. I look forward to sharing with you on a weekly basis a more in-depth that we would learn from the various Mishnayos. Emerges from one of Today's Mishnah that I'd like to focus on, an idea that emerges from the Mishnah in Peah, Parak Dalid, Mishnah Tes 4:9, where the Mishnah tells us Haleket Hashicha v'Peah shel Ovi Kochavim Chayv v'Maisros. The Leket Shicha and Peah, generally the produce that is gathered as Leket Shicha and Peah is not subject to the laws of Truma and Meiser. You don't take out additional agricultural gifts from the grain, from the produce that is designated as Leket Shicha and Peah. However, if a non-Jew who, as we learn in the Rabbi Bartanura, a non-Jew who has purchased a field in Eretz Yisrael and has set aside Leket Shicha and Peah like his Jewish neighbor farmers, that produce that is designated by the non-Jew as Leket Shicha and Peah would be subject to Maisros, because as the Rabbi Bartanura points out, there are two things that we learn from here. Number one, non-Jews are not liable, not chayav in Leket Shicha and Peah. Therefore, when a non-Jew sets aside Leket Shicha and Peah, it doesn't obviate the need to separate Trumos and Maisros from that produce. Number two, what we learn is that the land that is purchased in Eretz Yisrael by a non-Jew and is farmed by a non-Jewish farmer is still subject to the rules and the requirement of the obligations of Trumos and Maisros. In other words, the land that is purchased in Eretz Yisrael is by a non-Jew still contains Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, still contains the sanctity of the land of Israel, and that is the basis of the obligation of Trumos and Maisros. So this land that the non-Jew is farming, the non-Jew doesn't have to take Leket Shicha and Peah, but if it can be subject to that produce can be subject to Trumos and Maisros. How would that happen? Only if, let's say, the non-Jew farmed the land and then it was purchased by a Jew before the Shas Chiyav of Trumos and Maisros, namely before the produce, the grain had been smoothed out, made into a goren as migarncha. That's when Trumos and Maisros are obligated. If it's in the hands, if this produce that was farmed on land that was farmed by a non-Jew who had purchased that property in Eretz Yisrael, but the produce before it had been prepared, had been bought by a Jew, that produce, that grain, let's say, would be subject to the rules of Trumos and Maisros, because what we see is that just because a non-Jew buys land in Eretz Yisrael, it has not relinquished, that land has not relinquished its Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Now, the origins of this discussion about the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael being maintained even if the land is purchased by a non-Jew goes back to a Gemara in Gittin Daf Mem Zayin, Gittin 47, where it's a machlokas, it's a dispute between Rabbah and Rebbe Lazar, whether a non-Jew that buys land in Eretz Yisrael, whether the produce of that land is subject to Trumos and Maisros. Rabbah says that yes, the produce is still subject to Trumos and Maisros, and Rebbe Lazar disagrees and says produce that is farmed on land in Eretz Yisrael purchased by a non-Jew is exempt altogether from Trumos and Maisros. Now it's interesting to note that within the position of Rebbe Lazar, there's a machlokas, a very well-known dispute between the Chazon Ish and Rav Soloveitchik concerning how exactly do we understand this position of Rebbe Lazar. According to Rav Soloveitchik, when Rebbe Lazar says that the produce is completely exempt from any type of Trumos and Maisros, what it's saying is that there is no Kedusha whatsoever to land in Eretz Yisrael that was purchased by a non-Jewish farmer, right? And therefore there's no Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, And therefore, there's no obligation of setting aside Trumas and Maasros under any circumstances. According to the Chazon Ish, even though Rebbe Elazar holds that there's no Trumas and Maasros on land farmed by a non-Jew, purchased by a non-Jew, nonetheless, Chazon Ish holds that the land retains an element of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. And what does that mean? That means that although it's true that the mitzvos, Hatluyos Ba'aretz, the mitzvos that are associated with the land of Israel that are dependent on the sanctity of the land don't apply when it's owned by a non-Jew, but nonetheless, the Lotah says, right? So the mitzvah of Truma, the mitzvah of Meiser doesn't apply, but the Lotah says those things that we're not allowed to do with the land of Israel, specifically because it has inherent Kedusha, according to the Chazon Ish, applies even to land that is purchased by a non-Jew. So the nafkamina, let's say, between the Chazon Ish and the Soloveitchik, the rubber hits the road, and the difference between them are on matters that are Lotah says. For instance, the prohibition of Klaya Kerem, of planting in Eretz Yisrael two types of produce within proximity to one another. Klaya Kerem or Neta Ravai, the fourth year after produce begins to sprout from a plant, from a tree. These are things that are unique to Eretz Yisrael and dependent on Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Whereas Rav Soloveitchik would say that in Rebbe Elazar, there's no Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. So just like there's no Trumas and Maasros, there's no Klaya Kerem or Neta Ravai on land bought by a non-Jew. Chazon Ish would say no, that there is Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, just not to the threshold that obligates in mitzvos of Trumas and Maasros. But but it does manifest itself, the Kedushas of Eretz Yisrael, as it relates to Lotah says, like Neta Ravai and Klaya Kerem. Now, I want to bring the conversation to something that's halacha l'maisa in this year. This year is a Shemitah year, and one of the ways that farmers and poskim try to navigate the need for produce in Eretz Yisrael, but the reality of Shemitah, one suggestion that's made is the heter mechira. The heter mechira is a mechanism, some would say a loophole, a mechanism, but whereby the land is sold to a non-Jew for the duration of Shemitah, and therefore would that be allowed based on what we've learned in Rebbe Elazar. So before we get into Rebbe Elazar, let's just note that according to Rav Soloveitchik, yes, this would be a way within Rebbe Elazar. This would be a way of navigating Shemitah, because according to Rebbe Elazar, as understood by the Rav, land that's purchased by a farmer completely loses Kedushas Eretz Yisrael for purposes of Trumas and Maasros, for purposes of Klaya Kerem and Neta Ravai, and for purposes of Shemitah as well. Whereas according to the Chazon Ish, it's more complicated because it would depend on how we view the laws of Shemitah. You can go back to listen to my shiurim on Shemitah earlier this year, where Chazon Ish notes that if it's primarily a positive commandment of Shabbat haaretz, of allowing the land to rest and lay fallow, then the fact that the non-Jew owns it would obviate that. Just like there's no mitzvahs of Trumas and Maasros, there's no mitzvah of Shemitah. However, if the essence of Shemitah is not working the land, right? It's not the rest of the land, but it's the prohibition against tilling the soil and all the associated agricultural elements contained therein. Well, then the Chazon Ish would say, just like the Lotah says of Klaya Kerem and Neta Ravai apply even to land purchased by a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael, so too might the rules of Shemitah apply even to land purchased by a non-Jew. This is really a theoretical, hypothetical conversation, as we say, l'halacha v'lo l'maisa, because remember, the Rav Soloveitchik and the Chazon Ish are both working within the position of Rebbe Elazar in the Gemara in Gittin Daf Mem Zayin, who holds that land purchased by a non-Jew is not subject to Trumos and Maasros, but really the consensus opinion, the halacha, is that we paskin like Rabbah, as the Rambam points out in Hilchos Trumos, Parak Aleph, halacha Yud, that land owned by a non-Jew retains Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, and therefore we go back just to sort of expand upon. We're no longer directly involved in the Mishna and Peah, but to focus our attention on the discussion of Shemitah and the Heter Mechira. If the land, if we pass in like Rabbah and the Gemara Gittin, and the land retains its kedusha, it retains its sanctity, what is the halachic basis for the Heter Mechira that during the year of Shemitah sell the land to a non-Jew and therefore it would be permitted to work? So for that, we continue in the Gemara Gittin, Daf Mem Zayin, where the Gemara concludes that in Syria, that land purchased by a non-Jew is not subject to Trumos and Maasros. That even according to Rabbah, who holds that normally when a non-Jew buys land in Eretz Yisrael, the produce could be subject to matnos matana of Truma and Meiser, because there's a kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. But that kedusha that doesn't apply to Syria. Syria is outside the biblical borders of Eretz Yisrael, and the explanation given is because whatever practices of separating agricultural gifts, separating Trumos and Maasros that apply in these areas beyond the borders of Israel, let's say in Syria, that the essence of those obligations were never Torah, of a Torah level, midoraisa, but only midrabanan. And therefore, when a non-Jew purchases land in Syria, so the rabbinic obligation, the midrabanan of Trumos and Maasros, is removed because the land is no longer in Jewish hands; it's owned by a non-Jew. The Mishna and Chala, Parak Dalet, and Mishna Zayin, which we'll get to soon in Yirtzeh Hashem and Mishna Yomi, points out that the mitzvah of Shemitah is similarly not applicable in Syria once the land was purchased by a non-Jew, right? So we see that. So here we have an angle, a possibility. We see that when agricultural gifts, when agricultural mitzvos are only binding midrabanan, then when a non-Jew owns that land, then the obligation dissolves completely. So to bring it back to Shemitah, if we could understand that Shemitah today, Shemitah Bizman Hazeh in Israel proper is not a Torah obligation, but a mitzvah midrabanan, for whatever reason, if that was possible to explain, then the rule then we can apply the rule that we saw earlier by Syria, that on areas where agricultural mitzvahs are being applied midrabanan, if that land is purchased as owned by a non-Jew, then it's not subject to those rules, whether it be Trumos and Maasros in Syria, land owned by a non-Jew in Syria, or Shemitah, the laws of Shemitah would not be binding on land owned by a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael proper if Shemitah is midrabanan. So the next step is how can we possibly understand Shemitah Bizman Hazeh being a drabanan? So three approaches. One possibility is based on the Gemara Yevamos that we recently learned in Daf HaShavua, where the Gemara discusses whether the Roman occupation of Israel of Eretz Yisrael during the time leading up to Churban Bayit Sheni cancels the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. This is referred to as a discussion of kedusha is kitchel shaita or kitchel asidlavo. Is the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael binding just for its time, but once the Romans came in and displaced the Jews and exiled the Jews and destroyed the land, it's no longer binding, that's sanctity? Or is it kitchel asidlavo forever? Once it was sanctified, made sacred by Ezra, it continues to be, Eretz Yisrael remains a unique holy status forever going forward. So this is a machlokas. According to the Chachamim, Kedushas Eretz Yisrael was only kitchel shaita, but now the kitchel asidlavo. And therefore today, whatever agricultural mitzvos we apply to Eretz Yisrael due to its sanctified status is only midrabanan. That would allow room for the Heter Mechira, that if the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael today is midrabanan, because kitchel is shaita below kitchel asidlavo, therefore today the Shemitah would not be applicable on land in Eretz Yisrael that was purchased by a non-Jew. However, the problem with this is that this is one of those areas where The consensus of Rishonim hold against the Chachamim. Not only was the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael at the times of the Second Temple, but it continues to exist even to this day, meaning that the basic level, the agricultural obligations in Eretz Yisrael today are midioraisa. And therefore, just because a non-Jew would purchase land in Israel, it would not obviate the requirement of Shemitah, and Heter Mechira cannot get off the ground. So another possibility would be a Gemara earlier in Daf Lamed Vav, where it talks about the possibility of Pruzabul, right? That Hillel created this mechanism whereby loans would not be canceled in the Shemitah year, so that lending and borrowing could continue throughout. And the Gemara asks, how did Hillel have the standing and the audacity to ignore a Torah obligation of canceling debts? So the Gemara suggests that there's a pasuk that teaches us that Pruzabul works only at a time when Shemitah is not a Torah level obligation. So that when laying land fallow is only midrabanan, then canceling debts is only midrabanan and can be obviated through a Pruzabul. Why might Shemitah today be midrabanan? So there's a Yerushalmi that says that Shemitah is only a Torah obligation when we practice Yovel, the 50th year. When you think about, right, the Yovel is after 49 years. There's a big question whether Yovel counts as year one of the next cycle of Shemitah, or Yovel is a blank, it's a 0 year. And if it's a 0 year and we've lost track of the Yovels, then what happens to the status of the Shemitahs? At the very least, we're saying that today, Shemitah may be only a rabbinic obligation because the Yovel is not in practice. And if Shemitah is Bizman as Midrabanan, then if the land is purchased by a non-Jew, either he owns it already or through the mechanism of Heter Mechira, then the land would be able to be worked during Shemitah. The Rambam, so that's the second possibility of how Heter Mechira may work. The Rambam in Hilchos Trumos, Parak Aleph, Halacha Chavav 126, says that Truma is only midioraisa, a Torah obligation, when a majority of Jews live in the land of Israel. And absent that, Truma is still practiced, but it's midrabanan. And so some suggest that this also would apply to Shemitah today. Shemitah would be midrabanan so long as most of the Jewish community, the world Jewish community, the global Jewish community, is not living in Israel. This has brought up some interesting questions about demographics of the Jewish community today in 2022, in the 21st century, as Israel creeps closer to housing or being the location of a majority of Jews, right? It's hard to count every single Jew in the world, even though every single Jew counts. But theoretically, what if it came to a point? So up until today, if Shemitah is only midioraisa, if a majority of the Jewish community lives in the Jewish homeland, then Shemitah today will still be midrabanan. But what about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 25 years from now, where the demographers are indicating that a majority of Jews, and how do you define a Jew? Is it halachic? Is it by identity? Well, let's say it's even halachically. The majority of halachic Jews, there may be a point in the future, there will be a point in the future, presumably, that a majority of Jews, of halachic Jews, live in Eretz Yisrael. Would that change the status of Shemitah to D'oraisa? So over the summer, I was in Eretz Yisrael with a group from Mizrahi, Religious Zionists of America, and we had the opportunity to hear from Rav Rimon, who has a sefer about Shemitah, an excellent book that reviews all these laws, which I used for my shiurim earlier this year, in which he notes that this idea of a majority of Jews living in the land requires the Jews in the land of Israel to know which shevet they are from, which tribe they are from, and to live in their ancestral homeland as divvied up by Yoshua in the time of the original conquest, so that everyone has to know which tribe they're from, and each tribe to live in their land, in their portion of the land of Eretz Yisrael. That's when, according to the Rambam, Shemitah and Truma would be midioraisa. Since we don't expect that to happen until Mashiach comes, may it happen speedily in our days, so the status quo would remain until Mashiach comes and delineates who's from which tribe and where our ancestral tribal homeland is in Eretz Yisrael, it will remain as it is, and therefore, from that perspective, based on the Rambam and Hilchot Trumos, Shemitah would be similarly midrabanan, and if it's durabanan, then you have the possibility of the heter mechira, whereby on a Shemitah durabanan, if a non-Jew owns land in Israel, you can completely remove the obligations of Shemitah. The topic of heter mechira is a whole shiur in of itself that I've given earlier. I'm happy to send you the link. I believe it's available on my YouTube channel. But just an interesting progression from the Mishnah in Peah to discuss Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, leading into a discussion of Shemitah and heter mechira. I hope you enjoyed. Join me again next week for another edition.